In late August 1944, General George S. Patton's seemingly unstoppable Third Army ground to a sudden, absolute halt near the German border. They hadn't been defeated by the Wehrmacht. They had simply run out of gas. Hundreds of miles to the north, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was demanding every drop of fuel the Allies possessed for a singular, massive thrust into the heart of Germany. The greatest crisis on the Western Front wasn't triggered by enemy armor, but by dry fuel tanks and a bitter argument over who would get to keep moving. Why did the most successful military advance in history suddenly paralyze itself? The answer lies not in German resistance, but in an unseen enemy trailing behind the Allied forces. A fractured supply line anchored hundreds of miles back on the ruined invasion beaches of France. By early September 1944, the High Command was locked in a profound crisis. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was cornered into an impossible dilemma. He could deliberately starve his front of resources, physically halting the bulk of his armies in their tracks to fund one narrow, high-risk gamble aimed straight into Germany. Or he could maintain a steady, unified advance across a broad front, but at a pace so severely restricted by shortages that it would give a shattered German military the exact time it desperately needed to rebuild its defenses. This was a crippling logistical bottleneck colliding directly with the fragile politics of an international coalition. The debate over who would receive the fuel and who would be forced to sit idle in the mud became a strategic showdown that dictated not just the pace of the advance, but the future borders of Europe. To understand this sudden paralysis, we must look at the brutal mathematics of victory in September 1944. In the late summer of 1944, the Allied armies became the victims of a spectacular, unanticipated triumph. The explosive breakout from the Normandy beachheads in late July had triggered a massive, chaotic collapse of the German military across France. Allied planners had originally projected a methodical, heavily contested advance. The overarching blueprint for the campaign, carefully drafted before the invasion, expected the front line to rest at the Seine River, just past Paris, by early September. Instead, by the first week of that month, Allied armor had surged across the Seine, chased the retreating Wehrmacht through northern France and Belgium, and was already probing the pre-war borders of the Third Reich. The armies were nearly a full year ahead of the most optimistic operational timetables. But this sheer velocity created an expanding, invisible vacuum directly behind the armored spearheads. A mechanized army is a ravenous machine. A single infantry division consumed hundreds of tons of rations, ammunition, and equipment every single day, and an armored division demanded exponentially more. The supreme constraint on the Western Front was no longer the fighting spirit of the frontline troops or the resistance of the enemy. It was harbor capacity. Before retreating, German commanders executed a ruthless, highly effective strategy of port denial. The major deep-water facilities at Cherbourg and Brest were systematically demolished. Harbor floors were cratered. Massive industrial cranes were blown off their tracks, and the maritime channels were choked with scuttled ships and thousands of naval mines. Even when British forces rapidly secured the massive, entirely intact port of Antwerp in early September, the vital 60-mile estuary connecting those docks to the North Sea remained heavily fortified by German coastal batteries, rendering the pristine port completely useless to Allied shipping. This devastating reality meant that almost the entirety of the Allied logistical lifeline was still tethered to the artificial harbors and the sandy beaches of Normandy. As the front line rapidly accelerated eastward toward Germany, the distance between the combat units and their supply depots stretched from a manageable 50 miles to an agonizing 400 miles. The mathematics of this distance were brutal and unforgiving. To bridge the widening gap, the Allies established a massive, improvised convoy system of thousands of transport trucks driving day and night over degraded French roads. But basic physics dictated a harsh penalty for the distance. A heavy cargo truck driving 400 miles to the front line and 400 miles back consumed a massive portion of the very fuel it was attempting to deliver. On average, it took 5 gallons of gasoline burned by the rear echelon supply convoys to deliver just 1 gallon of usable fuel to the combat formations at the bleeding edge of the advance. By early September, the combined Allied armies required roughly 1 million gallons of gasoline a day simply to maintain basic offensive operations. They were receiving a fraction of that amount. The supply lines had stretched until they literally snapped. This total logistical paralysis directly collided with Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower's fundamental vision for the European campaign. Eisenhower was firmly committed to a broad front strategy. He envisioned a synchronized, continuous advance by all Allied army groups, British, Canadian, and American, pushing eastward side by side from the North Sea in the north all the way down to the Swiss border in the south. From a strictly military perspective, Eisenhower calculated that this relentless, uniform pressure would stretch the shattered Wehrmacht to its breaking point, completely preventing German commanders from shifting their limited armored reserves to plug any single gap in the line. From a political perspective, the broad front was arguably even more vital. Eisenhower was managing an inherently fragile, unprecedented international coalition. The strategy ensured that both the American public and the British Empire felt their respective armies were equally engaged in the prestige of destroying Nazi Germany. But the broad front was an industrial strategy designed for a fully supplied military force, and the fuel simply did not exist to execute it. The brutal reality of the logistics meant that dividing the critically inadequate trickle of fuel equally across all the armies would reduce the entire offensive to a creeping, agonizing crawl. It would give the German military precisely what it needed most: time. Time to man the concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line, time to repair their shattered panzer divisions, and time to prepare a coordinated, lethal defense. The mathematical deadlock forced a bitter realization at the Supreme Headquarters. To maintain the momentum of the pursuit, someone would have to be halted. Any tactical decision regarding fuel distribution was now inherently a choice of which Allied army to actively paralyze. The cooperative spirit of the Normandy breakout rapidly evaporated, replaced by intense nationalistic friction over every single gallon of aviation gas and diesel. This physical impossibility forced a severe crisis of command, setting the stage for one senior general to step forward and make an unprecedented, aggressive demand that threatened to tear the entire alliance apart. The stalemate broke not with a consensus, but with an ultimatum. On September 4th, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery formally signaled Supreme Headquarters with a proposal that shattered the illusion of a collaborative advance. He argued that the Allied forces were essentially fighting two separate, uncoordinated battles. To Montgomery, the solution was as radical as it was divisive. Eisenhower had to halt the American First and Third Armies entirely, stripping them of their fuel and logistical priority to supply the 21st Army Group for a singular, concentrated thrust toward the Ruhr Valley. This was not merely a tactical suggestion. It was an attempt to fundamentally restructure the theater's strategic priorities. Montgomery envisioned a massive, lightning-fast strike northward that would bypass the German defensive line, seize the Ruhr's industrial heart, and potentially force a surrender before winter set in. From a purely military viewpoint, the logic was difficult to dismiss. Concentrating the remaining fuel and transport capacity could, in theory, maintain the velocity of the breakout, preventing the German army from recovering its balance. However, the political cost of this maneuver was catastrophic. To execute Montgomery's plan, Eisenhower would be forced to ground George S. Patton's Third Army, the most successful and visible American force in the theater, at the very moment of their greatest momentum. Doing so would effectively relegate the American military, which was rapidly becoming the primary driver of the war effort, to a secondary role. The backlash in Washington would be immediate and severe. General George Marshall and his staff viewed the prospect of sidelined American troops with profound alarm, and Eisenhower understood that such a decision threatened to fracture the delicate Anglo-American coalition beyond repair. Eisenhower was caught in a vice. If he rejected Montgomery's plan, he risked losing the chance to strike a decisive, war-ending blow, leaving the armies to stall across a broad, thin, and vulnerable line. If he accepted it, he compromised the unity of the alliance and sacrificed the operational independence of his American commanders. He was no longer just managing a battlefield. He was managing the internal stability of the war effort itself. Searching for a way to thread this needle, Eisenhower attempted a desperate compromise. He refused to abandon the broad front entirely, yet he began funneling an outsized share of supplies to the north, effectively starving the southern sectors to feed a singular, high-risk northern gamble. This launched a frantic, disorganized scramble for resources across the entire supply chain. Divisions were stripped of their own transport, trucks were cannibalized to sustain frontline spearheads, and the once coordinated advance began to fracture into competing, desperate efforts to reach the German border. The unity of the campaign was being sacrificed in an invisible, grinding battle for the contents of fuel drums and the availability of transport capacity. On September 10, 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower met Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery aboard the British commander's tactical aircraft in Brussels. Eisenhower was still recovering from a severe knee injury sustained in a plane evacuation, forcing him to remain seated while Montgomery paced the narrow cabin. Montgomery presented a map featuring an audacious airborne and armored thrust designated Operation Market Garden. By dropping 3 Allied airborne divisions across a 60-mile corridor in the Netherlands, the 21st Army Group aimed to seize 8 consecutive bridges, outflank the northern tip of the German Siegfried Line, and cross the lower Rhine at Arnhem. Eisenhower refused Montgomery's renewed demand to permanently halt the American armies to the south. Yet, caught between the undeniable opportunity to breach the Rhine and the severe political necessity of supporting his British commander, Eisenhower authorized the operation. To give Market Garden a fighting chance, he directed priority logistical support to the north, allocating daily tonnage and transport assets away from the southern sectors. While Eisenhower still insisted on his broad front doctrine in official orders, his compromise effectively placed the Southern American advance on a starvation diet. The reaction among American field commanders was instantaneous and explosive. At the headquarters of the 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley protested the diversion, recognizing that every gallon of fuel rerouted north directly stripped his own armies of operational capability. 50 miles to the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army was suddenly anchored in the Lorraine countryside. On the morning of August 31st, Patton's spearhead, the 7th Armored Division, was operating on fumes, with its lead tank stalling just short of the Meuse River crossings. When Patton received the formal directive reducing his daily gasoline allocation from 400,000 gallons to a fraction of his minimum requirements, he recorded his fury in his diary, arguing that with full supplies, his forces could reach the Siegfried Line within 48 hours. Unwilling to accept immobility, American unit commanders abandoned standard logistical protocol. In early September, officers of the Third Army began actively intercepting supply convoys destined for other corps. Using altered shipping manifests and forged requisition paperwork, American supply officers diverted Red Ball Express fuel trucks into their own depots. When the 12th Army Group imposed strict rationing on 5-gallon gasoline cans, the iconic jerry cans, units began hoarding empty containers under camouflage netting, refusing to return them to central depots to ensure their own future allocations. The struggle for gasoline had degenerated into an internal contest of logistical survival among Allies. Across the front lines, this sudden drop in Allied velocity was instantly recorded by German intelligence. In late August, the German High Command had been operating in a state of operational collapse. Field Marshal Walter Model, recently appointed commander of Army Group B, had been forced to displace his headquarters twice in 1 week to avoid capture by advancing American armor. German radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance in early September, however, revealed an unexpected anomaly. The relentless columns of American Sherman tanks and half-tracks had ceased their forward movement. Intercepted tactical radio transmissions from American armor units increasingly cited fuel shortages rather than enemy resistance as the cause of their delays. For the Wehrmacht's intelligence division, Fremde Heere West, the data confirmed a crucial reality. The Allied supply chain had reached its absolute physical limit. The panic that had gripped the German high command throughout the retreat from Paris began to evaporate, replaced by the realization that they had been granted an unexpected operational pause. Model and the newly reinstated Commander-in-Chief of the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, seized this narrow window of time with absolute efficiency. On September 1st, the Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the Westfall, was largely unmanned, its concrete bunkers stripped of weapons and communications equipment to support the Atlantic Wall defenses years earlier. Taking advantage of the American halt, Model directed 80 improvised battalion-sized units composed of fortress troops, convalescing sailors, and Luftwaffe ground personnel directly into the fortified zone. Concurrently, the German transportation network, operating on short interior rail lines that remained functioning within the Reich's borders, rushed thousands of tons of ammunition and heavy artillery to the western frontier. Remnants of shattered panzer divisions, retreating across the Seine just weeks prior, were gathered behind the protective screen of the Westfall to undergo rapid reorganization. Within a span of 10 days, the open gap that Patton's armor had been poised to exploit was sealed by a stabilized defensive line anchored in concrete, deep anti-tank ditches and sighted artillery terrain. Simultaneously, the physical reality of the Allied supply pipeline was eroding under the sheer mechanical strain of its own operations. To sustain the front, the communications zone had launched the Red Ball Express on August 25th, a dedicated one-way highway loop stretching from the Normandy depots to the forward bases. Operating day and night without headlights to avoid German aerial harassment, thousands of cargo trucks were pushed far beyond their mechanical tolerances. By the second week of September, the physical consequences of this effort were crippling. Transport units were reporting catastrophic failure rates of vehicle suspension systems due to continuous overloading. Rubber tires, pounding over damaged French cobblestone and cratered asphalt at high speeds, were disintegrating faster than replacement stocks could be shipped from England. Over 10,000 vehicles were sidelined in field depots, awaiting spare parts that were trapped on cargo ships idling in the English Channel. The fundamental geometry of the Western Front had defeated the Allied logistics apparatus. The transport fleet could no longer generate the cargo capacity required to feed two simultaneous offensive operations. Montgomery had successfully secured his priority allocations for the massive airborne push into the Netherlands, betting his prestige on a singular northern thrust. But as the first transport planes began assembling on airfield runways across England for Operation Market Garden, the German defensive front, which had been fracturing just 2 weeks before, was now waning in strength. The reality of the logistical stalemate was about to be tested against a reinforced enemy. On September 17, 1944, the sky over the Netherlands filled with the largest airborne armada in history. Montgomery's singular thrust, Operation Market Garden, was underway, fueled by the sacrifices forced upon the rest of the Allied line. A persistent post-war myth suggests that if Montgomery had simply been given a little more fuel and complete operational freedom, he could have driven straight to Berlin and ended the war in 1944. But the brutal reality on the ground in late September shattered that illusion. Even with supreme logistical priority, the ambitious operation rapidly disintegrated. The single elevated road leading north, quickly dubbed Hell's Highway, proved hopelessly inadequate for an advancing armored corps. Supply trucks backed up for miles, paralyzed by German ambushes. British paratroopers at Arnhem were isolated and systematically cut to pieces by refitted SS Panzer divisions the Allied command assumed were incapable of fighting. The gamble collapsed not merely because of fierce German resistance, but because the supply line itself was fundamentally too narrow and overextended. Yet, the true strategic catastrophe of September 1944 was not the tactical defeat at Arnhem. It was what the Allies chose to ignore to make Arnhem possible. By funneling every available truck, gallon of gas, and ounce of command focus eastward, the Allies fatally neglected their own logistical survival. Weeks earlier, British forces had captured the massive, undamaged docks of Antwerp. But an intact harbor is utterly useless if the enemy controls the water leading into it. German coastal batteries remained heavily entrenched along the Scheldt estuary, completely blockading Antwerp from the North Sea. Because Montgomery's gaze was fixed firmly on the German border, no immediate priority was given to clearing these approaches. The one objective that could have resolved the entire Allied supply crisis was left sitting idle. The grand strategic debate over the single thrust did not end in a Supreme Headquarters boardroom. It died in the cold, rain-soaked mud of the Netherlands, as the unyielding mathematics of logistics finally caught up with the ambition of the High Command. By October 1944, the true cost of the command crisis arrived not in a singular dramatic battle, but in the freezing autumn mud as the entire Western Front ground to a grueling halt. With the airborne failure at Arnhem sealed, Patton firmly stalled before the concrete fortifications of Metz, and the approaches to Antwerp still heavily defended by German coastal batteries. Eisenhower was forced to officially accept what the fuel gauges had been signaling for weeks. The rapid pursuit across Europe was over. The grand illusions of ending the war by Christmas evaporated inside command tents from Belgium to Lorraine, replaced by the crushing realization that millions of men would have to endure a brutal, protracted winter campaign. The logistical paralysis that began in late August had fundamentally reshaped the strategic timeline. The Wehrmacht, which had been fracturing and disorganized retreating across the Seine, used the weeks bought by the Allied fuel famine to consolidate an unyielding defensive front along the West Wall. Because the Allies had gambled their transport fleet on a narrow northern thrust while leaving the port of Antwerp blockaded, the frontline armies were left to face the incoming winter on a starvation diet of ammunition and winter gear. The simple physics of distance and consumption had dictated what senior commanders had bitterly refused to accept in their strategy sessions. The German army had survived the destruction of Normandy and lived to fight another year, ensuring that the road to Berlin would be paid for in months of grueling attrition. Looking back at Patton's stranded armored columns and Montgomery's unmet logistical demands, the Great Command debate of late 1944 reveals a terrifying operational truth about the modern battlefield. When the engines of George Patton's lead tanks sputtered and died near the German border, it was not due to a lack of American aggression. And when British armor stalled on the narrow roads to Arnhem, it was not born of British timidity. For decades, post-war memoirs and nationalistic histories framed this autumn crisis as a bitter clash of personalities, the cautious Montgomery versus the relentless Patton. But this framing obscures the fundamental reality of industrialized warfare. The fierce argument at Supreme Headquarters was never truly a debate over military genius or tactical bravery. It was an involuntary submission to the absolute supremacy of logistics. The brilliance of a commander's strategy extends only as far as the fuel inside his lead tank. When a supply chain fractures, when deep-water ports are systematically demolished, when pipelines run dry, and when transport trucks break their axles on cratered roads, the grandest operational plans on Earth are instantly reduced to useless lines on a map. Dwight D. Eisenhower's greatest burden during the autumn of 1944 was not outmaneuvering the Wehrmacht. His most agonizing task was managing a fragile international alliance that was suffocating under the brutal mathematics of supply. He was forced to balance the delicate politics of a coalition against the unyielding physical limitations of cargo ships and jerrycans. The price of that mathematical deadlock was measured in time, and time was inevitably paid for in blood. The Allied armies would eventually break through the concrete bunkers of the West Wall and cross the Rhine, but the delay forged by the fuel crisis meant they would have to do so through the freezing snows of the Ardennes and the shattered trees of the Hürtgen forest. The march into Germany was no longer a lightning pursuit. It had become a slow, agonizing siege. In their relentless push across the European continent, the Allied High Command was forced to absorb the most unforgiving truth of modern mechanized warfare. Battlefield valor, brilliant tactical maneuvers, and overwhelming operational momentum are ultimately held hostage by the absolute, brutal mathematics of industrial supply. No matter how powerful the coalition, or how aggressive its commanding generals, a mechanized army can only ever conquer exactly as far as its fuel trucks can physically drive.